Hello, one and all. It's Religious Studies Project time again. As ever, I'm David Robertson, and
sometimes I'm Christopher Cotter.
And as now, you're Dr. Christopher Cotter.
Yeah, no, we've been banging on about that a little bit for a while, but I got the bit of paper to prove
Got
it.
the bit of paper.
No one can take it away now. They probably can.
Yeah, there's got to be some loophole. This week, we have another interview from our good friend Sydney Castillo down there in Peru. And this week, the interview is with Juan Fonseca Ariza and is entitled Politics of This World, the Protestant, Evangelical and Pentecostal movements of the Peruvian political landscape. So to explain further, I'll pass over to Sydney.
Professor Juan Fonseca is licensed in history from Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, and is also master in history of this university, from this university. His work focuses on the historical development of non-Catholic Christian movements in Peru, mainly Protestant and Evangelical, and the intertwining of their participation in politics and social movements. Welcome, Professor Fonseca, to the Religious Studies Project.
It's a pleasure to stay with you.
Pleasure is also ours. Now, we're here to learn some things about the non-Catholic Christian movement in Peru. In order to do that, we would like to know a bit more about the classification of this movement, right? Since the Protestant and Pentecostal landscape of Peru is counterintuitively enough a diverse one in terms of origins, theology, and political tendencies. Based on your previous research, could you please elaborate a brief classification of these movements?
Of course, in my last writings, I have raised the typology of Protestantism. This typology is based in the following aspects. First, its historical roots, national level and worldwide level, some interreligious characteristics, that is to say that the beliefs and the religious practices that make them singular within the set of Christianity. Mm-hmm. This includes their structures, their theology, their ecumenical practices, and the type of religiousness practiced by its members. Mm-hmm. And third is extra-religious emphasis, which include the ways its presence is articulated in the public sphere. For example, their political attitudes, some of attitudes towards the social practices, and some ideological points. Moreover, I believe that Protestant and Pentecostal are like two specific phases. Mm-hmm. Within the Peruvian Christianity. These two phases that coexist in Peru within the non-Catholic population. Mm-hmm. These two groups share their some theological characteristics, but also they reference in the Bible to define the dogma. However, there is a fundamental difference between the symbology that constitutes the base on which the religious practices or the religious devotes are constructed. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, the Protestantism, which is basically a rational religion sustained in the Bible. On the other hand, the Pentecostalism is a sensorial religion, mm-hmm. sustained in the constant and intense experience with the numinous. The Protestantism is like a religion of modernity, the Pentecostalism as a religion of postmodernity. Mm-hmm. And in this sense, Catholicism is like a religion from pre-modernity.
Mm.
About this theoretical base, I suggest the following typology. So, two big groups: Protestantism and Protestantism itself, and Pentecostalism. Protestantism itself, we can distinguish two groups: mainline Protestantism and Evangelical Protestantism. Mainline Protestantism, for example, includes churches like Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian. These churches has a very ecumenical attitude in its ecclesiology. Their theology is liberal, and political attitudes are very progressist. And the evangelical group includes some churches, for example, the Christian Missionary Alliance, the Nazarene Church, Baptist churches, Adventist Church, and their theology is more moderate, not necessarily liberal. Its political attitudes are moderates of center-right or center-left. On other side, in Pentecostalism sphere, we can distinguish two groups. Classic Pentecostalism, for example, some churches like Assemblies of God, Church of God, Pentecostal churches in general. In this field, their theology is more conservative, sometimes fundamentalist, and its religiosity is very pietistic, and its political attitudes are more conservative too. And the last group inside Pentecostalism is the charismatic churches. The charismatic churches, for example, includes a very large Christian communities. Agua Viva, Living Waters, is a very renowned community here in Lima. Camino de Vida, the Emmanuel Church, the Church of Bertolai, is very outstanding evangelical congressmen. These churches are very enthusiastic religions, very conservative theology, but these churches has a very good work in politics too, very effective work, but with politics very conservative too. So its attitudes are sometimes very linked to political right, and their moral is very conservative too. I think this is the spectrum of evangelical Christianity.
That's very interesting, because it's a present-day analysis, right? But you, as a historian, you of course have the research about the very beginnings of non-Catholic denominations in Peru. In that sense, and the question is, how was the relationship between the first wave of Protestant missions and the social movements or institutions that were present in the first years of the 20th century in Peru? We could name some like indigenism, syndicate movement, student movement, or feminists.
On the one hand, the Protestant missionaries of the early decades of the 20th century developed a strategy combining the following aspects. First, a political objective. the decline of the power of the Catholic Church, which will coincide with the most progressive sectors in different periods. Second, a cultural offer. The Protestants as carriers of civilization, in which they will also receive the support of the liberals. And third, a religious agenda, the Protestant as a confessional alternative for Peru. Well, this strategy was based, on the other hand, in the context from which it came. In the United States, the so-called social gospel has a strong influence on the missionary groups, particularly in Methodist, which is the first denomination in Peru. Although the more conservative groups, such as Evangelicals from Great Britain or Adventists, had a most pietistic and proselytist position. But they also had it clear that social action was part of their mission. On that basis, they developed a series of missionary initiatives in the social sphere. For instance, the development of the employment options for women, promoting female employment education in their schools, or fostering the development of the nursing profession, which at that time was only confined to Catholic nuns. In addition, it is well known the link of the Protestant missionaries with the first leaders of the Peruvian feminism, such as Maria Alvarado. In fact, one of the very old Methodist schools, Lima High School, now is Maria Alvarado. Furthermore, they developed links with indigenous people. Several of whose leaders, Manuel Vicente Villarán, Dora Mayer de Sule, expressed their appreciation for the Adventist work done in Puno. Similarly, Protestant missionaries developed some missionary projects with indigenous people in areas such as Amazonas, in Awajún people, Perené, with the Xaninca people, or Puno, with Aymara people. And in the area of trade unions and the university movement, the closeness between the Methodist pastor, Roberto Algorta, and labor movements are well known. In fact, Roberto Algorta was part for the temperance movement in the beginnings of the 20th century. John Mackay, the very renowned Scottish educator, has a very closeness links with the circles of intellectualism of the people from Lima in the 1920s. In addition, the Presbyterians of the people of Anglo-Peruvian school, with they has a very, very close links with some intellectuals and politicians like Víctor Raúl Aya de la Torre, José Carlos Mariátegui, and Víctor Andrés Belaúnde.
Now, since you have talked about the intellectual movement linked with some Christian denominations, and all these initiatives that were proper from the first decades of 20th century Peru, but nowadays, at least you could trace a little bit in mid-20th century, there's a change, a successful change in the way that these denominations do pastoral work. In that sense, we would like to ask you, your research refers that these first waves of Protestant missionaries were agents of modernization, directing their work to many institutions and social groups. But it also refers that in the last 50 years, a great portion of Protestant, Evangelical, and Pentecostal denominations aligned themselves, both actively and involuntarily, with more conservative ideas and political parties. When and why would you say is the turning point for this particular way of doing missionary work, and overall being Protestant, Evangelical, or Pentecostal?
Well, I think that transformations of the social approach of the missionaries started around 1940s. On the one hand, in the global context, the stage of the post-war period and the beginnings of the Cold War influenced on the conservatism of the Protestant churches. Thus, since the 1950s, new waves of missionaries with anti-communist mentality and with a pietistic missiological approach focused basically on proselytizing and the spiritualization of the Christian message will arrive. In China, communist revolution triumphed in 1949. So 3 years after, all the Protestant missionaries was expelled, and like 10,000. So the most of them came to Latin America with very anti-communist ideas. This is going to be acute in the following decades, when the foundations of the ideological Christian progressivism, communism, versus the Christian Evangelicalism, conservatism were led. The struggles between the conservative majority and the progressive minority, mainly grouped in the Methodist Church and the Christian NGOs, began in the 60s. Similarly to what happened with Catholicism, the nature of the debate was focused on the ideological dimensions of the Christian mission and ecumenism. In the 70s, it was clear that a theological conservatism had been imposed, but in a moderate version, whose best expression was the Latin American Theological Fraternity and the Association of Evangelical College Groups of Peru, AGEU. At the side of it, the great evangelical mass people attached to large denominations basically developed a pietistic religious practice and a hermeneutic fundamentalist. And on the other hand, the complex process of nationalization of the leadership of the Protestant denominations occurs in that context, just when the conservative speech and fundamentalism was in progress. Obviously, that explains why many of the Protestant national leadership took a conservative, anti-ecumenical, and even fundamentalist speech. So the CONEP, the National Council of Evangelical Churches, starts its activities in 1940s. And the CONEP was, or the leadership of CONEP was very national, with national people. They became institutionally independent, but they inherited the ideological imprint of the missionaries from whom they complained. Thus, as we enter in the 1980s, the field was ready for the emergence of fundamentalism. Somehow, violence of terrorism delayed that process for a short while, because moderate evangelicalism made this speech hegemonized, at least in evangelical cooperation entities, and especially in CONEP, the Evangelical National Council of Peru. Since then, most of their leaders have belonged to the moderate evangelicalism. However, this hegemony began to be questioned by a growing and very well-organized fundamentalist force, which caused a deep crisis in CONEP. So this like a neo-fundamentalism represented in the leaders of charismatic movement was different from moderate evangelicalism in its vision of the church and its political ideology. The neo-fundamentalism is not necessarily anti-intellectual. You can even say that it is relatively illustrated and fits very well to the parameters of the democratic public sphere. This neo-fundamentalism or neo-fundamentalists is very active, politically speaking, always supporting the agenda of right-wing political groups. Between 1993 and 1995, an outpost of this group decided to take control of CONEP, the National Council of Evangelical Churches. The damage that this battle produced in the main evangelical institution was prolonged, although later on the moderates could retake control of the institution. But the neo-fundamentalists empowered themselves and began to construct the spaces of collective institutions on the basis of which they would promote their agenda. Those, the FIPAC, the International Fraternity of Christian Pastors, and Peruvian Fellowship of Evangelical Pastors were developed. These institutions are very conservative, very fundamentalist. So, throughout the 21st century, the strength of neo-fundamentalism of those very conservative groups has continued to grow. CONEP has been the battlefield between the ultra-conservative groups and the moderate minority that still maintains its presence here. And sometimes CONEP is very strange institution because their presidents in the last years was always moderate or even liberal pastors. But when they took the presidents, immediately they act like prisoners of conservatives. So the CONEP people says, well, the president is liberal, but it's just symbolic position, but they has no power, no effective power inside institution. So the UNICEF, the formation of the Union of Christian Evangelical Churches, its other institutions different from CONEP, mean the new attempt of the right-wing evangelical groups to hegemonize with a reactionary speech. An additional factor in this brief history of is the influence of the American neoconservative agenda, North American conservative agenda. Since the 1980s, the right-wing religious party has been strengthened considerably in the United States and globalized in the last decade. So the objectives of the crusade to the demands of sexual minorities, feminism, and secularism in general, and for a decade their actions have become globalized. I think it is one of the protagonists of, for example, the homophobic speeches and the practice of Christian conservatism in Peru.
As you may know, in March 12 of 2016, the Marcha por la Familia y la Vida, or March for Life and Family, took place. It is an annual interdenominational march organized by the Archdiocese of Lima that gathers most of the conservative Christian and political wings of Peru's civil society against abortion and same-sex unions. In that sense, what is the current impact of the Pentecostal and Evangelical movement as part of a wider conservative coalition in this political struggle? Also, why would you say are they so focused on these particular issues?
At present, it is clear that the neo-fundamentalists have managed to hegemonize, at least at that point. On the Catholic side, the statements of the Episcopal Conference, the Bishops' Conference, have been clearly reactionary. And at this point, all the wings of the Catholic Church handle the same speech, at least publicly. Progressive groups are afraid of saying something for fear or for indifference. Well, but on the Protestant side, the Evangelical side, the internal battles that have occurred in the past years about this subject also showed that the neo-fundamentalist speech succeeded in cornering moderates and progressives in a way that they had to abide to the homophobic tide, which at this time has been extended by the evangelical churches. The neo-fundamentalists have succeeded in associating their speech with the essentiality of the evangelical identity. I think that for the Protestant people, evangelical people, the members, their identity did not necessarily imply being, for example, homophobic. Thus, as part of the conservative strategy was to normalize, naturalize the relationship between evangelical religious discourse and Far's opposition of sexual diversity or abortion and other issues like this. The conservative pressure has been so strong that it has managed to neutralize almost all voices inside the local Protestantism that began to show some sympathy to the LGBT cause. They have done it with unethical methods many times, but finally effective. For example, the campaign for the recall of Susana Villarán recognized that conflict of powers in which the neo-fundamentalists won an important repositioning. There are several areas of action in this spread of homophobia, speech, and religious practice of conservative Christianity. On the one hand, theology and biblical hermeneutics produce the ideological foundations for the construction of the pastoral homophobic discourse to the interior of the churches. On the other hand, the political discourse of religious hierarchies in the public sphere is more and more careful with using religious categories, except for less sophisticated groups. Finally, in the practice, this transconfessional alliance of neoconservatism or ecumenical fundamentalism has a more active set of factors who are positioned in the various political groupings in the country, as well as in social spaces, traditionally reluctant to change, for example, the education or the military institutions. However, the progressive minority, silenced for decades, also begins to build speeches in which theological discourse or the practice of the faith are compatible with the promotion of the sexual diversity rights, or some other issues of progressive agenda.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that we have covered a bit more of the conservative part, we would like to go to the other side of the spectrum. This is the last question. Now we're facing the second round of presidential elections on June 5 of 2016. While it's a common misconception that being Christian equals to being political conservative, thus favoring religious and secular conservative candidates, a recent pronunciation of an interdenominational Christian collective favoring a left-wing candidate has been circulated in different social media. Why this kind of political stances hardly find any correspondences in the majority of Peruvian Christians?
Well, I'm not sure that the this manifesto of progressive Christians, among whom I include myself as well, have impacted too much on electoral decisions of evangelical voters.
Mm-hmm.
I think the evangelical voter is more independent than many people believe, and votes according to rationales that are not always religious. However, I think that actually there is an ultra-conservative and fundamentalist core that is militant in the crusade anti-rights that its hierarchies have initiated. Although it is a minority, it is very powerful in its media presence. They have managed, as I said, to naturalize the relationship between the gospel and the conservative media and public opinion in general. Well, in that context, the progressive evangelical voices are even less than the fundamentalists, but hold key positions in the evangelical institutions. For example, the Connect, the Bible Society, the Christian NGOs, some seminars, and even some denominations. In that sense, I think the dissemination of the pronouncement of Christians in favor of Veronica, the left-wing candidate, is a very positive step, because it shows that some of them are already learning to position themselves in the public debate with the same aggressiveness as conservatives and articulated with national political actors. In this case, with the left-wing Frente Amplio. In that way, I think that an interesting way has been marked, so that in the future, progressive postures expand their capacity of incidence within the churches and also in the Peruvian society in general. And I think it's very positive.
Well, Professor Fonseca, it's been a pleasure to have you here in the Religious Studies Project. We have learned a lot about the non-Catholic Christian movements that are in our country for more than a century now.
Well, thanks for this opportunity.
See you next time.
It's wonderful to hear that interview there. And of course, although a lot of our podcasts will be about politics and the political in a sort of broad sense, because everything is political, right? We very rarely actually focus upon the sort of manifestations of religious organizations in the political sphere. I can think of actually an interview I did years back now with Suzanne Owen about Druidry and the definition of religion in a UK context that particularly spring to mind, and there'll be a few others there.
Or possibly Tariq Madood on secularism and secularization. But yes, it's something which we're hoping to bring you a little bit more of next, after our summer break, when we have a series of episodes on the subject of NGOs in Asia. So we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, excellent. And, I think I can pretty much commit us already to, in 2018, will end up, because the BASR and ISASR joint conference is happening in Belfast in September 2018. So I'd be pretty sure we'll get a few interviews about religion and politics from that conference. Just, to be stereotypical about my homeland.
And we're already looking forward to this year's BASR conference, which is happening in Chester in September.
In September,
early
yes, indeed.
September. And if you go to basr.ac.uk, you can find out the call for papers. You've still got a whole month to get there. In fact, more than that. I think it's it'll be a month from when this goes out to get your paper in and come and join us for what is always a very friendly and productive conference.
And on that note, I'll just mention that there will be bursaries available for students, postgrad students, and early career scholars. We still probably haven't announced that yet because I've been slacking off, but bear that in mind if you're thinking cost might be prohibitive to come to the BSR conference, and there will be bursaries available.
And don't forget, if you are coming, you'll get to take part in the RSP's annual Institution of the Christmas Special, this year being hosted by the Jonathan Tuckett.
Fantastic. So, next week, it's an interview that I had the privilege of recording just last month, actually, with Keisha Ali of Boston University. And we talked about sexual ethics and Islam, which is one of her most famous books. So we talked about that broad subject. And particularly, we talk a lot around the sort of area studies nature, because that might be a book that people in, I'd say, RS in the main don't really interact with because it's maybe seen as area studies. So we do a lot of discussion about that kind of that perceived divide and
Excellent.
And how much more useful it would be if everyone read everyone's work.
Yes, wouldn't it? And it would be so much better if there was 50 hours in the day. Alas, there isn't. But thank you for giving up the last 35 minutes of your day to listen to this episode. As ever, if you wish to support the RSP, you can do so at no cost to yourself by using our Amazon affiliate links when you shop online. That's .co.uk, .com and .ca. You can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook. Please do comment on the website and send your emails, as ever, to editors@religiousstudiesproject.com. If you use us on iTunes, please do leave a rating. It helps us get the message out to a wider audience and really does make a difference. Other than that, Chris, there was something you were going to add, wasn't there?
Thanks for listening.